Thank you for being with us on this frosty January morning. Secretary Gates, welcome to Philadelphia.
Thank you, and thank you all for being intrepid enough to show up at an early hour.
Well, congratulations on the book. The book is called A Passion for Leadership, Lessons on Change and Reform from 50 Years of Public Service. And you said in the book that you had young people in mind as you wrote it. Why is that, and what do you want to say to them through this book?
One of my concerns is that I think a lot of young people choose not to go into public service today. I saw in the military, as president of Texas A&M and now as national president of the Boy Scouts, a lot of people who in their teenage years and college years and early military service years who were very idealistic, principled, and eager to serve, and they're very much engaged, particularly in college and scouts and so on, in volunteerism and in doing public service. But that all kind of gets derailed after they graduate from college. And I read in the Wall Street Journal about a year ago that 25 years ago, roughly 30% of the federal workforce was under the age of 30. And today it's 7%. So a quarter of what it was 25 years ago. And so one of the, I think, and part of the reason young people don't go into public service is that they see particularly government entities, whether it's local, state, or federal, as moving at a glacial pace, hierarchical, not very competent, and sometimes arrogant in the way that they deal with the people they're supposed to serve. And young people they're not prepared to wait in line to make a contribution 10 years from now. They want to make a contribution right away. And other venues offer them those opportunities. And so it's a circular, I mean, it's sort of a, what I hope to do is by encouraging people in both the public and private sectors to reform and change organizations and make them better, is also to create an environment in which more young people are willing to go to work for them because they can be proud to work there, because these places work, they're cost efficient, they're friendly to the people that they serve, and they do what they're supposed to do.
Why is it so difficult to bring about reform, particularly for large institutions like the ones that you talk about in the book?
Well, I think there are several reasons. One is, particularly in the public sector, most organizations are subject to oversight by elected officials. And often elected officials' agenda is more personal than it is in terms of what's good for the city, the state, or the country.
I'm sure we have no idea what you're talking about.
And also, change often involves risk. It can involve, people putting out stories that are negative about the change that is being contemplated. So for a politician, there's a lot of downside to change and a lot of risk associated with reform if you really want to get it done. A lot of them talk about reform, but it's mainly just talk. Another problem is that there are a lot of stakeholders involved. So you may have, whether it's business interests or lobbyists or a variety of other people who want things to stay just the way they are, that don't want change, don't want reform. And then it's just hard. You have a lot of people the people who work for you, if you're a reform leader, people who were there before you got there and will be there after you leave, and if they don't want to change, and if they don't like, if they're not on board, they can just outweight you. And so there are a number of these and a number of other considerations that make leading reform a challenge, and really the heart of the book is about how you get past all that. How do you get people who are the career professionals to be a part of your team? How do you get them on board with your agenda? My view is, and I say in the book, that I think Americans at every level of government have the most honest and capable public servants of any country in the world. So, and I believe that nearly all of them want to be proud of where they work. So the question is, how do you earn the respect of those career professionals and make them your allies in pressing for change, so that when you're gone, they become defenders of the reform process? So I mean, there are some very big obstacles, and to tell you the truth, this applies to a lot of places in the public sector, in the private sector as well. So I've tried to go out of my way in the book to make it clear that it applies not just to government, but to business, nonprofits, really to any organization. The fact is, all organizations, as the longer they're around, the more barnacles they accumulate. And if you want to make your organization better, then it seems to me that these are some guidelines. As I say in the book, I've led CIA and the intelligence community, Texas A&M, the Defense Department, and now the Boy Scouts. And I've loved every one of those organizations, but I've also believed from the very beginning that all of them could be improved. And that's basically what I've tried to do.
So reform delayed can lead to crisis, and you cite several examples early in your book about some pretty spectacular bureaucratic failures. The aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, scandals in the Secret Service, in the Veterans Administration. We've been watching the news this week and seeing what's happening in Flint, Michigan. We've got all this brain power, all this technology, all of this training, both in the public and the private sector, and yet we still have these failures. How is it that we're still seeing these kinds of problems?
Well, I think it's because there really has not been a serious effort to tackle reform in any of these organizations, and it unfortunately takes a crisis to get people's attention and call attention to the fact these organizations aren't working as well as they should. I mean, and if you want to, and my examples in the private sector are, I don't think that the CEOs of General Motors and Chrysler intended to drive those companies off a cliff, but they did. And so what decisions, what process did they have that ended them up in such a bad place? How did some of the private sector people involved in the financial collapse in 2008, how did they make they didn't intend to crash their Bear Stearns or some of these other institutions. So the question is, how do leaders fail to see that their organization is not headed in the right direction, that the decisions that they're making are not the right decisions, and then the list in the public sector is kind of endless, actually. To start with, 9/11 itself represented a catastrophic failure of intelligence and law enforcement. So I think partly what I talk about in the book is partly it's due to leaders being insular and egotistical, and too many leaders not having people around them who are willing to disagree with them. Too many leaders are like Samuel Goldwyn, one of the founders of MGM, who I quote in the book, who said to his staff, "I want all of you to tell me exactly what you think, even if it costs you your job." and a lot of leaders say they want candor, but they really don't. And so how do you create an environment around you where you have people coming in and saying, you know, that may not be the best decision. I always told people, whether it was at CIA or the Defense Department, I said, I want to be warned about a landmine before I step on it. And that's your job, is to warn me if I'm about to make a mistake. And if you think I've made a mistake, to tell me so afterward. So I can at least revisit it, maybe change my mind, or maybe I'll adjust my plan. That doesn't mean you have to do what your people tell you all the time. That's ridiculous. But it does mean being aware of the downsides of the decisions that you're trying to make and potential consequences, so you can weigh all of the factors without sort of blindly pressing ahead on one path in the belief that there is no alternative, or that that there are no weaknesses or problems. So it's the insularity and the isolation of the people who lead organizations. It's the failure to hold people accountable. When I fired the, you know, there are people in Washington who lose their jobs all the time because of personal misbehavior. But when I fired the Secretary of the Army because of the way we were treating our outpatient wounded warriors at Walter Reed Army Hospital, the thing that astonished Washington was that I actually fired somebody for not doing his job well enough, for not being competent. And I fired others. I fired the program director for the F-35 program, and others as well. So accountability is a piece of it, and people knowing they'll be held accountable. So I think leaders head off in the wrong direction too often because of their own personalities, their own conceit, their own ego, and the failure to create an environment in which they surround themselves with people they think are smarter than they are, and who they can turn to and count on for candid advice.